Professor Michael Graziano, thank you so much for coming on to Evolution Soup, all the way from your office in Princeton University, New Jersey. You are a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University, and your scientific research focuses on the brain basis of awareness. Not only that, you are an author of several fiction novels, as well as a composer of music, as we can see. Today, we're going to be tackling something a little bit different to what we usually do on the show, and that is the subject of consciousness, what it means to be conscious, and when and why it might have arisen in our evolutionary history. Welcome to the show, Michael. I can only imagine that when you tell people you study the origins of consciousness, you end up with some pretty interesting conversations.
Yes, I think so. I think it's a topic that's intrinsically interesting to everyone.
Before we dive into the world of consciousness, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Michael, where did you grow up, and can you describe the road that led you to where you are now?
Sure, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I was there until I went away to college actually at Princeton. I've been at Princeton a very, very long time, um, other than a very brief stint away when I was in graduate school. I was at MIT in Boston. And then I came running back to Princeton. I didn't like the outside world. I wanted my my safe lab and environment and people here at Princeton. So I've been at Princeton for a very long time in various capacities. Now as a professor, and I run a lab. How I got into consciousness? I mean, that's I think everyone's interested in this topic. I think if you talk to psychologists, but especially neuroscientists, although they study a lot of different topics in neuroscience, a very high percentage of them started out when they were wee little budding students. They started out with an interest in this question of consciousness. So it's kind of built into us, I think. Um, and so that I think that was there for a very long time. I studied as a neuroscientist. I studied very nuts and bolts issues, how the brain processes sensory input, how it controls movement. I did a lot of that work. I made a lot of contributions over the decades, um, and the work on consciousness, focusing my lab on this question of subjective awareness. What does it mean? How do neurons produce this stuff? Actually, kind of emerged naturally out of the work I was doing on movement control, how the brain controls the body, and that began to morph into how the brain controls itself, um, and how the brain builds a model of its own body kind of began to morph into how the brain builds models of itself. And so it was kind of a natural progression to get from really nuts and bolts topics into these more these really interesting questions of cognition and awareness and attention. So that's kind of where that went. It's been maybe about 15 years now that I've been focusing my lab on this question of awareness and attention and consciousness.
And also tell us about your work that you did with primates, Michael.
Right. So I mentioned that I did, as I call it, nuts and bolts work on movement control and on sensory processing, and a lot of that work was on non-human primates. So I did a lot of work in the 90s, especially. That was kind of what I cut my teeth on, so to speak, as a scientist. And a lot of the contributions I made are in that domain. So working with non-human primates monkeys is really interesting. It's really difficult, actually, and but they're a really good model for trying to understand certain aspects of brain function. And when I began to move into this question of consciousness, well, the primates, the non-human kinds, weren't as good because you can't ask them. You can't ask, well, were you conscious of that? Were you aware of that one? So you necessarily had to put them aside and move to the human variety, the human primates.
Well, it's a big topic, and so perhaps we had better kick things off by asking, what exactly is consciousness?
Right. That's a very good question. So the word has changed in its definition over time. And at this point, I think there's a kind of definition that researchers use. And it may be a little different from the way people in the general public think about it. And it's different from the way people had thought about it for many years. So, really, the beginning of all this is 100 years ago. You have William James, who first starts writing about consciousness and the stream of consciousness. He actually coins that term, the stream of consciousness. So, 100 years ago, people are thinking of consciousness as a stream of content, right? There's memories, and then there's sensory impressions, and there's beliefs that come up, or emotions, or whatever it is that's floating through your mind. Consciousness is the stream of content. And what happens is, uh, around the middle of the century, as computer technology begins to ramp up, and you have people like Alan Turing asking, well, can machines think? What will machines eventually be able to do? People begin to realize that the stream of consciousness, the things, the items that are in that stream, computer technology is beginning to be able to do, right? So this slowly growing computer technology has memory of a sort. It can remember and recall things. It can process sensory input. You hook it up to a camera. It can make decisions. It can choose thing A over thing B, and so on. So the content itself is beginning to sound like something that can be engineered. And I think what happens is, as we move through the second half of the 20th century, people start getting anxious. It challenges their sense of the sanctity of the spirit, so to speak. And so you have a rise of a slightly different perspective, a slightly different philosophy, and you start hearing things like the hard problem, right? And so this is Chalmers in the 1990s now talking about the hard problem. And the idea of the hard problem is, okay, sure, there's content, there's memories, there's sensory processing and decision making and this and that. But in addition, there's some extra essence and experience, kind of like a magic experiential essence, for lack of a better word, that goes along with those things. So consciousness, then, the way scholars start thinking about it, is not just I look at an apple and I process the color and the shape. Consciousness is, in addition to doing that, I have a subjective conscious experience. Sometimes people call it a phenomenal experience. And that's kind of a magic thing that arises up in the brain that's somehow non-physical in its nature. So that becomes what consciousness is. That becomes the focus of the research, this hard problem, or this experiential essence. Experienceness is a word I sometimes use, even though that's a little bit of an abuse of the English language. So that becomes the focus, and it kind of still is in many ways in the field. How do you get from neurons in a brain doing their thing, chemically and electrically talking to each other? How do you get from that to this magic experienceness that emerges out of it, sometimes called the explanatory gap, right? And so now we have theory after theory after theory, lots and lots of theories, and they all focus on that explanatory gap, right? So the field of consciousness studies has a little bit of a flavor of, I call it alchemy, because the question people are asking is, how do you put ingredients together such that poof, magic comes out of it, and you get the experiential thing coming out, right? And so there's lots of guesses and lots of theories, but they all suffer from the same problem, that there's a kind of explanatory gap in there that's conceptually unbridgeable. So that's kind of where things stand right now. Most scholars would say consciousness is experience, subjective experience itself. And that experience attaches to only a very small amount of the information being processed in your brain at any one time, and we don't know what makes the experience emerge. As for my view, and I'm not alone, I think there's a growing number of people now really focusing on this. My view is that this framing is a little bit inhibiting the field, and it's a little bit of a red herring. And what's really going on is that when you talk to someone, you ask them, "Are you conscious? What is your conscious experience? What are you feeling and experiencing right now?" And they're answering. What they're doing is drawing on self models, right? So a model is a bundle of information constructed in the brain, and it depicts something. And the brain builds models of all kinds of things, but the outside world, for example, a visual model, or some other kind of model. But among those models, the brain builds models of itself, self-descriptive models. And so that's what that is, right? When we talk about ourselves, we're drawing on these bundles of information in our brains that are self-descriptive. And this is the key to it all. So we are these essentially biological machines that say we have conscious magical experience in us because we have self-descriptive models that depict us in that manner. And so that becomes a very information heavy and computational heavy approach to explaining the behavior of this big biological machine. And it kind of puts aside these more fuzzy questions of the magical essences. It essentially says we don't have magical essences. We're machines that think we have them, and we think we have them because that's the nature of the models that the brain builds of itself.
Well, on this show, we discuss the evolution of animals, including the human animal, as well as evolutionary processes. The evolution of the brain and why it became bigger and smarter is one thing, but the evolution of that amorphous thing we call consciousness is a whole different ballgame. Michael, what has your research revealed about the evolution of consciousness?
Well, that's a fantastic question. So the very first thing, if you want to understand the evolution of consciousness, is trying to get a grasp on what it does, what its adaptive value is. And I think that's where the work that I do and other people do is coming in really useful, because the whole point is to try to think of consciousness, as I said, as a model, a self model. Systems need self models in order to monitor themselves, in order to predict their own behavior, in order to control themselves, right? So this is something that actually has a really specific usefulness to it, and that allows you to begin to think in evolutionary terms. When do self models emerge? When do really sophisticated self models emerge? And so what we think is going on is that there's a process in the brain, a very specific kind of process that neuroscientists call attention, and attention is a colloquial term, and so it can get a little confusing. But really, just generally speaking, attention is a specific way that information coded in the cerebral cortex, in particular, is enhanced. It's very selectively enhanced. You look at a visual scene, and some of it is enhanced, and other parts of the scene are kind of suppressed. And so the enhanced parts are processed with more oomph in the cortical system, and they end up having a bigger downstream impact. This is called attention. And attention means that you process things, certain items, deeper, in a very deep way that allows you to give a much more rich kind of response to them. And what we think is going on is the brain not only uses attention, it also builds itself a little cartoonish descriptive model of what it's doing. And it's that little descriptive model that gives us our sense of consciousness. It's the brain, in effect, reflecting on itself, trying to understand what its own internal processes are, right? And so within that framework now, you can really begin to place these events in evolutionary history, because first of all, when does the the cerebral cortex evolve? Like, this is a really straightforward question. We know this from looking at phylogeny, and mammals have cerebral cortex. It turns out birds have something that's homologous. That is, it's not called a cortex, but it's the same kind of structure, and it serves the same function, and it evolved from a similar root structure. It's called the wulst. It's a part of the brain, and so birds have this thing that's basically a cortex, and mammals have a cortex, and reptiles, which lie at the root, reptiles have this visual wulst. So the evolution of this brain structure, this wulst that evolves into a cortex, this is probably 250 million years ago. Somewhere in that time scale, you have reptiles evolving this thing to greater and greater degree, and then from that you get these two branches. One, of course, leads through the dinosaurs, ultimately to birds, and the other one leads through mammals and ultimately to humans. So all of these different groups have the underlying brain structures. They have attention. They all there's oodles of experiments on all of these different groups of animals that show they have the basic mechanisms of attention. They all probably have these self models of attention, without which I don't think a brain can even control its own attention. You need a model of yourself to be able to control yourself. So you need a model of attention to control your own attention. And so I'm guessing that the thing we think of as consciousness is probably present in some manner in this huge swath of vertebrates. So some reptiles at least, and probably all birds and probably all mammals. This is this huge branching tree that has at least the basics of what we're thinking of as conscious experience. And that's not to say it doesn't exist in other animals. There's lots of speculation, really interesting speculation about other lineages that might have evolved really similar mechanisms. For example, there's a lot of really interesting talk about octopuses, which are a super interesting special case. So these mechanisms could evolve independently in other lineages. But my guess is that mammals, birds, and some reptiles have really similar underlying neuroscience and underlying mechanisms that subserve conscious experience.
Michael, in terms of our own lineage, the hominid lineage, you've spoken about something called the primary driver. What do you believe that is?
So, in trying to understand this evolution, this whole sweep of evolution of consciousness, I think there's kind of two adaptive advantages that emerge. And one is, well, why would a brain evolve to build models of itself? And that has to do with monitoring, predicting, and controlling yourself. A brain is a control engine. And that's one thing. That's one adaptive value to it. But there's a whole separate one, which is once you have this machinery, once you have this ability to build models, predictive models of how your own brain works, you can in principle use that to predict the brain states of other creatures, right? You start using the same machinery to understand, what is that creature going to do? What is that creature paying attention to? How is that creature going to behave? And so you start building models of essentially the minds of other creatures. This is sometimes called theory of mind, or social cognition. And this, I think, is something that's crucially important. You talk about drivers, and one of the main drivers of the evolution of all of this is we don't just think of ourselves as conscious beings. Consciousness is not just a private thing. One of the main things people use it for is socially, we project it onto each other. We see each other as conscious entities. We live in a sea, we swim in an ocean of perceived consciousness all around us. It's the sort of the social matrix in which we live. So where did that come about, or when did that come about? I think that probably this social component begins very far back in evolution, but I think it really kickstarts with primates. So I think that this intensive use of consciousness, the concept of consciousness as part of our social toolkit, is a very um, hominin thing. I mean, it's a very human thing, and we depend on that, right? So it's the secret of our success as a species is that we're cooperative, and we're cooperative not like in the way that ants are with very low level rules that results in a very complex overall organization. We're cooperative in the sense that I can go up to a person and kind of intuit what's going on inside that person's mind, right? I automatically, I can't help it, it's like a reflex, I automatically see that person as a conscious being, and it's almost like I can feel the consciousness emanations coming from that person's head or beaming from their eyes. And the reason is because we evolved as social animals. We have this massive social machinery that projects uh, models of mind and consciousness onto each other. And so I think that got a huge kickstart, um, and ramped up massively in our evolutionary past. I think the advantages in terms of group cohesion and cooperation, and the ability to work together as a community, the advantages were so enormous. I mean, obviously they were. Look at us, we dominate the whole planet now, um, because we can work together and build stuff together and integrate together. The advantages were so enormous that essentially whatever genes gave us this social machinery, this ability to project models of conscious minds on each other, those were ramped up. Evolution basically took hold of those volume knobs and cranked them all the way up to 11, because the higher that volume goes, the bigger those parts of the brain become, the more socially capable we become. And so we end up as these species that are incredibly, incredibly prone to see consciousness in everything around us, right? So it's good for us in the sense that it promotes this cohesion and cooperation, but it has a whole bunch of really weird side effects because we become this species. I've said before that we probably should have been called Homo spiritualis instead of Homo sapiens, because we're definitely a very spiritual species. I don't know how wise we are, but we're very spiritual. Or Homo socialis, because we're very social. But we are prone to see spirit or consciousness in everything, right? I mean, you go back in antiquity, and it's animism is common. So people are seeing conscious minds in the rivers, and the tree that falls over. Well, it did it because it wanted to knock your house down, or the lightning bolt was the wrath of Zeus. Everything is seen in this context of what's the intentionality behind it. So what we have basically is in humans we have these two really strong modes of understanding and interpreting the world around us. And one mode is what you might call the physical mode. We look at the world and we say, okay, this thing fell and it hit that thing and that caused that, and gravity does this and water pushes on things. That's the physical cause and effect that we understand about the world around us. And the other mode of thinking is the intentional or conscious, implied consciousness. We look at the world and we say, oh, that happened because somebody wanted it to. The fire happened because the the spirits got mad at us. Um, the things went wrong in the village because vengeful gods got angry, right? So we're very prone to think in terms of these theory of mind or intentionality types of explanations. We do both, but because we evolved, because it was so advantageous to us as a species to become so socially cooperative, the tendency to see mind, conscious mind in things got revved all the way up to the very top, and now we see consciousness at the drop of a hat.
And I suppose, Michael, going back to hominids hunting on the savannah millions of years ago, assuming every moving thing in the grass was alive was advantageous for survival.
Yeah, so there's this whole idea called the hyperactive agency detection device, or the HAD. And the idea is that uh, you see a little rustle in the grass, and it might be a tiger, or, well, I guess it would be a tiger in the African savannah. It might be a lion, or it might be the wind. But if it's the wind and you think it's a lion, that's okay. You waste a little bit of energy running. But if it's really a lion and you think it's the wind, you die. So it's much better to make the mistake of thinking that it's a predator. It's much better to attribute some kind of mind or intentionality or agent. And so that's the idea that we have built into us a hyperactive detection of agents in the world around us. But I actually don't think, I mean, I think that's probably true. I think that's probably very important, but I don't think that really drove the incredible amount of human oomph that we put into seeing minds and spirits everywhere around us. Um, I think that's a social adaptation. I think that emerges from just the fact that by being a social species and around people, and so sensitive to each other's minds that we intuit what other people are thinking in this way that is almost spooky. It's almost uncanny. The subtlest little situational cues or facial cues tell us what's going on in great detail in other people's minds. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. We evolved that enormous skill, and it's hugely advantageous, but it does come with these side effects. The side effects are that we tend to see mind and spirit and intentionality in everything around us. So it tends to drive a whole set of really weird behavior, in addition to the really socially advantageous behavior.
So, could this perception of intentionality have led to things like superstitions and even religions in hominids?
Yes, I think that's exactly the path there. Um, so what is religion? I mean, well, religion has, I guess I would separate spirituality and religion. Religion is a more general umbrella term, and religion includes a lot of social, ritual and tradition. Uh, but spirituality in specific, the tendency to believe you live in a world that's full of spirits, disembodied spirits, or spirits that live in inanimate objects, or to believe that there's a spirit inside of you that can leave, and especially after you die, to leave and go somewhere else. So these are spiritualist beliefs, and these I think definitely emerge very naturally from our social machinery. So we're kind of built that way. We're built specifically to believe uh, in souls, right? So what is a soul? That's another word that has changed meaning over time, so it's a little bit tricky. But I think for most people today, a soul is essentially the non-physical essence that lives inside of us, that probably floats out of us, after we die. That's the idea of a soul. Um, and so, what is that in terms of social cognition? Why are we so prone to believe in that? And I would say this is a model that the brain builds to understand itself. Okay. And it's a simplified model, it's a schematic sketch of what's going on in there, right? The brain does not need really detailed information on itself. Like, no brain controlled agent needs to go around saying, okay, I have 86 billion neurons inside of me, and they're communicating this way and that way, and this is why I'm doing this and why I'm doing that. Like, that kind of self knowledge is not adaptive, it's not advantageous. So what evolves instead is these very, very simple, stripped down um, self models. So the non physical or invisible essence, energy like essence inside of one. Um, this is just a cartoon sketch. It's like a caricature of what the brain is really doing, but it's really useful. And this is the important point. Self models are really useful. They're important. You need to monitor yourself. You need to understand and predict yourself in order to guide your own behavior. And those models have to be simplified. They have to be simplified. So I think the statistician George Box is credited with the wonderful phrase, all models are wrong, some are useful. And so I think that's what's going on here. The brain builds self models. They're always wrong. All the brain's models are wrong at some level, but they're simplified. These models are really useful. They're useful in our social connectedness. I see essentially a mind or a spirit in you. I see it in me. I see it in the people around me. And this is part of what binds us together. It's part of what allows me to understand other people as intentional conscious agents and to get along with you all, right? So this part is really, really important and I think really adaptive. And so I think there's a kind of very skeptic science-y perspective sometimes that spirituality is some sort of mistaken pre-scientific superstition. We should all do without it. But I think what my work is saying is actually it's kind of a natural outgrowth of our social machinery. We kind of can't help it. And it actually has an enormous usefulness to think of ourselves and each other in these very simple, pared down, but useful ways. Sometimes I compare it to the Newtonian picture of the solar system. So in that Newtonian picture, you kind of reduce the planets to little point masses. And the sun is a big point mass, but they're just very abstracted point masses that move along abstracted, simplified trajectories. And that's a wonderful way to make predictions about the solar system and to build a model, a mental model of it. And I think that's what we're doing. I think that's what the soul is. It's taking the complexities of an actual biological brain that's computing things, and it's simplifying it down to a little point and saying there's an essence inside of me, my soul, right? And now I can make predictions about what my mind or spirit is going to do. So yes, I think that's probably the origin of that aspect of religion.
I'm sure quite a few people watching this interview are now asking themselves, how on earth does a scientist study consciousness? You can't exactly put it on a slide and look at it under a microscope. So how does this research work?
That's an excellent question. Well, there's a whole bunch of different techniques. I think what it comes down to is you're asking people. In the end, you're asking people, did you see it? The spot on the screen? Did you hear the sound? Are you conscious of it? So you always, in the end, have this reliance on self-report and the things that you investigate. I mean, one of the types of technique we use is behavioral studies. So we can manipulate visual images, and we can manipulate how much distraction or noise or this or that is going on, and we can see how that impacts people's awareness of this event or that event, and what that does in terms of their performance on a variety of tasks. We look at relationship between attention and consciousness. All of these are experiments one can do by parking people in front of a computer and having them press keys and look at images on the screen. One of the more interesting methods, of course, is to stick people in a scanner, an MRI scanner, and see what brain systems light up. And so, for example, one of the things you see is that the systems, when you ask people, are you conscious of this? And certain brain areas light up. Those are the same systems that light up when you ask people about someone else's mind. Is he conscious of this? What is he thinking? And so you really start to see that there's systems relatively focused on theory of mind, on what is a mind, what's in the mind, can I predict the mind? And those systems can apply to other people and they can apply to ourselves, right? And so what we normally think of as consciousness may just be theory of mind applied to ourselves. But these systems in the brain become very reliable. They're very they show up in all these different types of experiments. Of course, another thing you can look at is a brain injury. So there's a lot of really interesting work out there on people with stroke damage or other kinds of damage, and you find the parts of the brain that, when damaged, cause the very severe or long-lasting deficits in a consciousness or awareness. There's some fascinating syndromes. So there's one. I mean, these are all unfortunate, horrible things that happen, but they end up being scientifically really interesting. So there's one called that I'm particularly interested in, called neglect, hemispatial neglect. And you get damage on one side, say the right side, and you lose awareness, consciousness of everything to the left side. It's just gone. It's erased. It's a very bizarre phenomenon, so that you don't even know that you're missing it, because you can't think about it, because it's entirely gone. So so you're not blind over there. If someone throws a baseball at you, you're likely to duck. Your brain is processing it, but you just don't know it. You're not conscious of it. And these areas of the brain that get damaged, that cause hemispatial neglect, are also the same areas that are involved in processing theory of mind, in understanding what a mind is and what other people are thinking. So all these different parts begin to sort of fit together at the experimental level. Anyway, these are some of the ways. One of the tools that we can use, that we're beginning to use in my lab, is computational studies. So we can try to build artificial models, artificial systems, AI, that mimics some of these aspects of the brain. And so we can try to put some of these theories to the test. And that's been a really interesting, kind of exciting, really enormously growing area of research in consciousness research.
Well, it's an incredible subject, Michael, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to come on to the show today. So, what's next for you? Any projects that you can tell us about?
The main thing that I'm interested in right now, or at least that my lab has begun to focus on, as I mentioned, is the computational side. So we're very interested in AI, and we're very interested in building at least very simple agents, what are called neural network agents, to try to understand what it means for an agent to model itself. That is, right now in artificial intelligence, people build these neural networks. They have artificial neurons, and you have millions or billions of these neurons hooked together, and then you train them on some task. You want them to do something like solve math problems, or talk, as in the case of ChatGPT. But one of the things we're interested in is, well, what happens if you train them to build predictive models of themselves, right? What does that do to the structure of the network? What kind of benefits does it bring? Is it similar to what we've been hypothesizing about the human brain for a while now? And also, I might add, since we think in humans this is such an important basis of social cooperation, maybe it also helps make these AIs more prone to cooperation, to social cooperation. But this is something that my lab has been moving into, studying essentially at the computational level. What does it mean for an agent to build models of itself?
Michael Graziano, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I had a wonderful time.